I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Um, as you know, because I've seen many of you on the previous ones, we've been running these free live Zoom programs Thursday since the lockdown, and we will continue to do them at least through May. Check our website. We've got all the programs up there. Next Thursday night only, we're not doing it 12 o'clock, but Thursday night we're doing a really interesting program. Dion Ford is a Montclair resident and co-authored a book called Slavery's Descendants. That's the story of reconciliation between the enslaved and the enslavers. So it should be a really interesting discussion. Then the week after that, Helen, who's on and who's a member of our Board of Trustees, is doing a presentation on Upper Montclair's history. And then the final Thursday in May, I have been researching the 1918 pandemic, or epidemic as they called it back then, as seen through the Montclair Times. So that should be kind of fun. We welcome both new memberships and donations. We, like so many other small businesses and nonprofits, are really doing our best just to try and squeak by during these times. As I said, you can do a membership or a donation if you're enjoying these programs. You can do it either on our website. There's a join or donate button. You can do it via Venmo. You can search for Montclair History Center. It'll come up as @Jane Eliasoff, but it really is going to the Montclair History Center. And you can also send us a check the old-fashioned way, just to 108 Orange Road, Montclair, New Jersey. The final thing I'd like to do is introduce our speaker today, Rich Rockwell, who has graciously agreed to be part of this program with us. He has been a councilman in Bloomfield for 2 years, and since his retirement last year, he's been spending a lot more time, hiking and doing volunteer maintenance work along the Lenape Trail, particularly in terms of the invasive species management on the trail. He's a board of the Historical Society of Bloomfield. He maintains their archives and their website and also publishes some of them in books. Most important for today's presentation, he's become a go-to expert on the Morris Canal in our area. He does presentations, but from what I understand, he does a phenomenal walking tour. And
okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rich Rockwell. Thanks for the introduction, Jane. I used to live in Montclair, too. I live in Bloomfield now, but I lived in Montclair for 6 years, back in the 90s. So, yeah, I'm an enthusiast about the Morris Canal and know a lot about it, especially in Bloomfield. And I'm going to talk today. I put this together. I have been volunteering with the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, which monitors, manages, and takes care of the Lenape Trail, organizing volunteers and maintaining. And I've been doing some volunteer work with them. And I put this program together for them. So it's focused on a little bit about the Morris Canal, a little bit about how that connects to hiking and the Lenape Trail, and how a lot of these hiking trails that are managed by the Trail Conference have a lot of interesting industrial archaeological sites and historical artifacts. So, and we'll have time for questions at the end. There's an organization called the Canal Society of New Jersey, which encompasses 2 canals that were in New Jersey. The Morris Canal in the northern part of the state that went through the highlands, the neck of New Jersey, and the Delaware and Raritan Canal, which is in the central New Jersey, if you believe there is a central New Jersey, Princeton, New Brunswick area. The Delaware and Raritan Canal is a lot of it is maintained as parkland and trailway. This is what it looks like in the fall. It's a great place to go hiking. This is a section north of Princeton around Kingston and Rocky Hill. The Delaware and Raritan was a wider, deeper, more level canal. They were able to create that canal just using locks because they weren't climbing mountains like the Morris Canal did. So they were able to, it was able to maintain more easy to maintain it and continue it as a park, which they've done. So when we're talking about the canal, this is what a canal boat looked like. Canals were pulled by a team of mules on what was called the towpath. You can see the mules over there on the left. They were usually led by someone, often a child, often barefoot, and sometimes there were families that would live on the boat. where you see the captain standing there, there was a little room the size of a closet where they could sleep and have some, you know, that was where they could live. Some families did that. So when we talk about the towpath, there are still towpaths in existence. So that was where the mules would walk. There were a couple famous people from Montclair who were involved in the canal. Israel Crane was on the original board of directors, and Ephraim Beach was chief engineer. He married Israel Crane's daughter, and their son James lived at 73 Beach Street, which was named after him in Bloomfield. So the canal, when they
Rich,
first built, yes.
Rich, I'm sorry to interrupt, but somebody says they're not able to see your shared screen. Are others having that problem? If
No.
no's or yeses in the chat.
No.
No, we're okay.
No.
Okay.
I can see it fine.
Peter, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what's going on your end. Okay.
When they first built the canal, Lake Hepatcong was the highest point, and they thought that they would be able to use water from Lake Hepatcong to supply water to the canal in both directions, all the way to Phillipsburg in the west and to Newark and Jersey City in the east. But as the canal was really in operation for a while, that wasn't really enough water. So they built some other feeders to other lakes, like you can see here, Greenwood Lake, Wanacue. It was the Wanacue watershed through a feeder through Pompton, near Pompton Lakes. And these are the main cities that that you'll recognize that the canal went through. Jersey City and Newark. Originally, it went as far as Newark. They expanded it at one point to go all the way to Jersey City. They went up through Bloomfield, Patterson, Little Falls, Boonton, Dover, and so on up to the west of Phillipsburg. One of the reasons they built the canal was there were coal fields in Pennsylvania, and they started to bring that coal down to the Delaware River. They built canals to be able to do that, but when they got it to the Delaware River, there was no convenient way to transport it from there. So they built the Morris Canal. Going through the New Jersey highlands, there were a lot of iron forges and iron mines in the North Jersey highlands area. They were having to go, some of them were having to shut down because they ran out of fuel. They used charcoal to fuel the iron forges, and it took thousands of acres of trees to create the charcoal that they needed to run these forges, and they essentially had stripped most of North Jersey of the trees and didn't have any fuel left. So it was convenient that the canal came along. They were able to deliver coal to the iron forges and also deliver the finished iron products to distribute them. And also, it was very important to be able to bring coal into this area and into Newark and New York to provide coal for heating homes and also for industry.
No,
So
I'm in Montclair history watching a Morris Canal presentation.
So this graph shows the coal tonnage in black. So it was a little more than half of the tonnage on the canal was coal. But there were other products that were shipped to farm products, the iron ore and finished iron products. There was a leather industry in Newark that used tanning bark and terracotta, and ice was one of the products too. The canal originally, the boats only held about 30 or 40 tons, which wasn't really very practical. In 1945, they started to rebuild the whole canal to make it wider, deeper, and to accommodate larger boats. That's why you'll see a surge in freight after 1850. And the real surge was around the Civil War, when they were transporting a lot of iron that was related to war products and support for the war. And then when you see the graph sort of dropping down after 1870s and 1880s, that's when railroads started to become more in use. And initially, they started building railroads at a lot of these iron forges and iron mines to get the iron move the iron ore around and get it to the forges and get the finished product. So they started building these feeder railroads that often went to the Morris Canal. And eventually the technology developed. They built more and more railroads so that railroads could be used to transport all these goods instead of the canal. The canal was labor intensive, and they only ran 6 days a week. They didn't run on Sundays. They didn't run in the winter. And they could only carry 75 to 100 tons of coal on one boat. It took 5 days to get across the state. When the railroads came in, they could operate 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and it was much cheaper and more efficient. So they became the preferred means of transporting these kinds of goods and other goods too. So the Morris Canal is called the water climbing waterway, or water climbing canal. I mean, mountain climbing waterway. It actually climbed about almost 1,000 feet to the summit near Lake Hopatcong from the Newark area, from the east. So the way they were able to do that, it wouldn't have been practical to use locks. Locks are only good for raising and lowering boats about 10 feet. So they came up with this idea of inclined planes. And they were completely hydro-powered. It was a real engineering marvel. The water came from the upper level of the canal up here into a flume, dropped down into this tube and spun a turbine, which turned gears that turned a drum up here that had a cable on it. And that would pull a cradle car up or down the inclined plane, usually from 60 to 100 feet. There was one of these in Bloomfield that was about 50 feet. I'll show you where it was a little bit later. And they were, the cradle cars were sort of like railroad cars. They were on iron tracks, like railroad tracks. And the boat would, the cradle car would go down into the canal. The boat would pull up and get onto the cradle car, and then it would go up the inclined plane or down. And it was also hinged in the middle too. I'll show you some pictures of that too. So that when it got to the top of the plane, the boat and the cradle car could navigate the summit of the plane. What was a scientific American, being the engineering marvel that it was, featured this inclined plane technology in an 1882 issue. This is actually the inclined plane in Bloomfield in these drawings. You can see in the top the drawing where this is where the boat was hinged. When it got to the top of the inclined plane, this is why it was hinged, so the boat could negotiate the summit of the plane. And there was a two-person operation. There was somebody stationed in the plane house here to control the water flow to make the car move up or to move or stop. And then there was somebody positioned on the cradle car in a little shanty. So the canal basically went east and west across the state, but the section through Bloomfield was mostly north and south. And this is a map that shows the green is the Garden State Parkway, the blue is the canal, and you can see that a whole section of the canal was where the Garden State Parkway is now. This is part of the story of the Morris Canal. A lot of it was turned into highways or obscured, or parts of it were buried under highways or now non-accessible by highways. This is a bridge in Bloomfield, the Berkeley Avenue Bridge. This is a typical scene on the canal. You can see the towpath there on the right. This bridge, this was one of the one or two remaining bridges that were built to span the Morris Canal that was still in existence as of a few years ago, but it isn't anymore. They tore it down and replaced it a few years ago. They had to have, to get permission to do it. The Morris Canal is on the State and National Register of Historic Sites, but the bridge wasn't. So because it was a contributing factor, they had to get permission from the Historic Sites Council to demolish the bridge. And to get that permission, they had to agree to a whole list of conditions One of them was the bridge used materials that were similar to the original bridge, that it maintained the trail under the bridge, that they do a historic interpretive sign. That's what you're seeing in the picture on the right. And they also did a survey of the whole canal throughout Essex County. So we found the bridge had to be lowered 5 feet and had to be realigned slightly for safety reasons. But I worked with them in their Section 106 review process and made sure that they did keeping the materials similar. They were originally going to make it a green stained concrete, and I pointed out to them that wasn't what the original bridge looked like, and they found this decorative railing that looks very much like the original bridge, and that's what they used. So it ended up being a fairly good project. And when the way you walk on the trail now, you're walking right in where the canal used to be. So you're right at the bottom of the canal. And another photograph of the bridge from the other direction. And then this is one example where when the canal was abandoned, this section was filled in and used as a recreational trail. So this is Wrightsfield. We call it the towpath. People call it the towpath, but it's really where the canal was that was filled in and the towpath. And this is Second River over here on the right. Second River is over off to the right of that photograph. Second River was channelized by the WPA in 1939 to try to improve the flooding conditions. There was one lock in Bloomfield. It was Lock 11 East. The locks and plains were numbered from Lake Apatcong to the east and to the west. So this was the 15th lock to the east from Lake Apatcong. There was another lock 16 in Newark. And this was at Montgomery Street. So another one of the stories of what happened to the canal was a lot of places where the canal used to be are now parking lots. In some cases, they were encroached upon. In some cases, people bought the property. But this is an example of what the canal looks like now. It's a parking lot at an auto body shop on Montgomery Street. And another thing that's happened to the canal was mentioned before, used as highways. This little section near Liberty Street is now the Garden State Parkway. This is the comparable scenes then and now. And at Liberty Street, in a lot of cases where there was a bridge, like there was at Liberty Street over the canal, when they built JFK Drive, they built JFK Drive right in the right-of-way of the Morris Canal from Liberty Street all the way up to Hoover Avenue and up on through East Passaic Avenue. Where there was a bridge like this, they usually graded it, so they eliminated the bridge. Another view of JFK Drive and then and now photos of where the canal used to be. The railroad bridge that you see in the background was what was originally the Montclair Greenwood Lake line that's now abandoned when they did the new Montclair connection on the Boonton line. This is the section of the trail that was abandoned. And we're hoping this becomes a rail-to-trail project, and we'll be able to connect to the Morris Canal Greenway to the Essex Hudson Trail. If you go to the left in the photograph, you'll end up in Montclair. Go through Glen Ridge and you'll end up in Montclair. So this was the inclined plane in Bloomfield. This was inclined plane 11 East, the 11th plane from east from Lake Apatcong. And when you're driving on JFK Drive and you go from the Baldwin Street, you go under a James Street Bridge, Baldwin Street Bridge, up an incline towards Hoover Avenue, the reason the incline is there is because that's where the inclined plane was. And the house over here on the left is the Collins house. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later also. So they started that, the canal was losing a lot of business that wasn't being used very much. Early 1900s, they knew that something was going to have to be done with it. They were going to either have to abandon it and figure out some kind of plan There were a couple initiatives to try to figure out a plan for what to do with it that sort of stalled. Around 1912, people started talking about making the canal into a state parkway, meaning parkland to maintain. There was a guy in Montclair who started an organization called the Morris Canal Parkway Association in 1912 with the idea that the canal could be preserved as this parkway. And these are actually photographs from this brochure that they put together that it could be used for canoeing. The little wooden structure you see in the background was an aqueduct that went over the Passaic River in Little Falls, and could be biking and horseback riding. And then around the same time in 1912, one of these investigation committees to try to figure out what could be done with the canal also published a report, and they hired the architectural firm Carrere and Hastings to do a series of renderings showing what we could do with the abandoned canal as parkway. And they took sections of actual parkway of the canal, like this section in Bloomfield. That's the top of the inclined plane on the right there. And then they did a rendering of what it could look like if it were preserved as parkland. Another section.
That's too bad they didn't do that. That would have been a nice park.
It would have been extremely expensive. One of the reasons they didn't do it
Okay.
was it took a lot of effort to get the water into the canal and keep it in there. It had the constant maintenance of making sure, trying to patch leaks, maintaining these locks, aqueducts, and inclined planes. And when I showed that map way back, talking about the Wanacue Reservoir, that area up in the Highlands, that's where we're getting most of our drinking water now. There would have been conflicts about whether we should be using water for drinking water or for this canal, but it would have been very expensive. It would have been nice if they could have done that. In 1974, the canal was named a National Historic Landmark. And then about 15 years or so ago, there were these little sections of the canal that were still in existence, some of them with water in them as parks, and some of them just as recreational trails, like I mentioned in Bloomfield with Wright's Field. And some people started to say, why don't we try to get everybody together and sort of coordinate all these little pieces.
What's that?
So they started with this idea 10 or 15 years ago. In 2012, NJTPA, the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, started coordinating 150 different organizations that were involved with the canal across the state, and created a working group to bring people together. And then in 2018, they funded a corridor study, which was to come up with ideas for, even though we can't still have all these contiguous pieces of canal connected across the state, what can we do to try to connect them and preserve as much of what's there, and also add additional trails. They've done a lot of work in Passaic County to add trails around Little Falls. They're doing a big project in Jersey City now. Some places they're actually buying property that was private property that used to be canal and turning it back into parks as part of a statewide greenway. So Bloomfield said, gee, we've got a lot of potential for greenway in Bloomfield too. So we started a committee, the Morris Canal Greenway Committee in Bloomfield, and the town designated the right-of-way of the canal through town as greenway officially. And we created a committee that's doing a number of things. One of them was we created an app. You can search for this in the App Store or Google Play, just searching for Bloomfield, Morris Canal Greenway. That shows you, this is the logo that's used by the app. And that shows you what it looks like when you're in the App Store on the right-hand side, photograph. And using the app, it shows that the actual, where the Morris Canal is the double green line that you see on the left. The red line is the walkable part of the trail. So in that example on the left, we're walking through Wright's Field under the Berkeley Avenue Bridge that I showed the photograph of earlier. And then that section where the canal sort of curves off to the north, That's now a parking lot, so you can't walk through there. So we're walking down the street for that section. And the little, those little icons are landmarks. And when you're at that location, you can click on one of the landmarks and see the photograph. So the photograph there is an aqueduct. There were two aqueducts in Bloomfield. They were like bridges that carried the canal over the rivers. There were two. The canal was close to a couple rivers in Bloomfield, Second River in this section near Wrightsfield, and Third River near Foleyfield, because that was the lowest and most level section of land. But the river and the canal never communicated. The river was in all these locations around here. The river was lower than the canal. And when it had to cross the river, they built one of these aqueducts to cross. So we've got a lot of these historic photos as part of the app. But you can also use the app to look at when we got the mapping of the canal across the state, we put it into the app. So when you have the app open, you can trace the path of the canal all the way across the state. So the section on the left shows how you're going from Belleville. That's not the red, where it doesn't have the red trail. That's the red trail is where Bloomfield starts. And you see those pins with the landmarks. And then from going east, after Bloomfield, the canal went through Belleville near where Claramas is, and then connected to Branch Brook Park where the light rail station is. When the canal was abandoned in the 1920s, the property reverted to the state, and the state offered it to the municipalities that it was in. Newark bought theirs right away because they wanted to build a subway in it, and they did. That was the city subway. They built the Newark City subway in the bed of the Morris Canal. It's now the light rail. And it ended at Branch Brook Park. So from Branch Brook Park, that's where the light rail, the subway ended. But Bloomfield bought theirs also, and they were planning also to make a high-speed trolley line, but that never happened. They would have connected Newark to Patterson. Bloomfield it would have been about halfway between Patterson and Newark on this high-speed trolley line, but that was another thing that never happened. By the time, it ended up being, the canal was abandoned for almost 30 years in Bloomfield before anything was done with it. It was just a weed field ditch. The photo on the right shows how the canal, using our app, you can follow the canal up through Clifton, around Garrett Mountain, Woodland Park. But you can do the same thing all the way across the state. And we also have a series of these wayfinding signs. You may see them if you're driving around Bloomfield. This one is near where the aqueduct was on Newark Avenue, near Newark Avenue. And we have a map of showing the whole canal throughout the town, and then a zoomed in section of the place that you're at right now, showing where the canal used to be. And you're right here, and showing some of the other landmarks like the aqueduct, and then showing the path, the walking path for the trail. So I mentioned the Collins house. The inclined plane was behind this house. The before pictures are on the left. There was actually a hole in the front of the house. You can see a radiator sitting there. It looks like it's going to fall out. So as part of the Morris Canal Greenway initiative and the committee that we formed, we wanted to preserve this house. And finally, after many years, we're making some really good progress. We got a roof, we got to have it stabilized and patched the holes, got the windows and painted it. We've been trying to get funding. It's been very challenging. We haven't been having much luck with state funding. The town has funded all of the work that's gone on so far. And the phase we're in right now is doing some of the infrastructure, the electrical and plumbing work. And we don't have the funding now to complete the interior, but we're hoping to do that sometime in the future. We want to have some museum space on the first floor, a caretaker's apartment on the second floor, and some conference space also. But it's going to be important to have a caretaker living in there. One of the reasons it is in such poor shape is because it was vandalized, because it was vacant. This actually, so the inclined plane was right behind it. There were two generations of Collinses who were carpenters on the canal, who built bridges and the aqueducts. And the Collins family actually owned this property. The canal company bought property from them to build the inclined plane where it was behind this house. And you can see the house if you're at McDonald's on Broad Street and you look across the river towards Kinder Towers. Kinder Towers is off to the left of the photograph here. And when you go up JFK Drive, where the inclined plane used to be, if you look over to the side, you'll see the house. We also are putting some interpretive signs around town. This is the intersection of Liberty and JFK. We also have a tradition of working with scouts. There was a monument put in this location by Cub Scouts in 1960. And then last year, another scout, as an Eagle Scout project, refurbished the place, cleaned up the weeds and put in some pavers and did some landscaping. And the photo on the right is the scout who did the 2019 project. And the man on the left is a scout from 1960 in the photograph from 1960 when the scouts put the monument there. So a lot of the canal in Bloomfield is buried under the garden, the JFK Drive, and even though you can't see that it's canal, you can walk along it. So we've got some land. We're going to put more of these interpretive signs with the trails. We've got the wayfinding signs showing that you can walk along the sidewalks on JFK Drive, and you're walking the canal trail. When you get up towards Wright's Field, you can continue walking on the sidewalk. And then beyond Hoover Avenue, East Passaic Avenue, north of there, most of the canal is buried under the Garden State Parkway. That was actually one of their rationale for putting the parkway through Bloomfield. They said, gee, we've got all this land here that we're not going to have to tear down houses. We'll just put it where the Garden State Parkway was. Well, they ended up tearing down a lot of houses anyway, but so there were a couple places where the canal sort of jogged. There was a curve in the canal that didn't follow the alignment of the parkway. This little section here is one. This is now a park. I'm going to show you some pictures of that at Oak Tree Lane. This section here, this is Broad Street in West Passaic. This is West Passaic here. When you're on the parkway, and this is where the new state police headquarters is right here. When you are on the parkway and you look at the state police headquarters, if you look behind it, you'll see a fence, and behind that fence is an abandoned section of the Morris Canal. When we do these hikes, I have been leading hikes a couple times a year. We take a bus ride up to this section to not force people to walk 10 miles. The whole distance of the whole canal through Bloomfield was about 5 miles. So we take a bus up to this section and walk through it. We were not able to do, we had to cancel our hike this year. I hope we can do one in the fall, or maybe we'll do some revised ones where we don't have to be on with social distancing. So when you get past the police headquarters, you'll come to the Upper Montclair Golf Course. And that section of the canal, we can't walk through either because it's on the golf course. But there is a section of watered canal that still exists as a water feature on the golf course. This is a photograph of it on just looking at now. This is the section at Oak Tree Lane about six or 7 years ago. It was pretty filled in with brush and shrubs and weeds and dumping. People had been dumping here. There was a lot of trash, appliances, and this was another Boy Scout project also. The Scouts did a project where they cleaned all the trash up, cut down most of the weeds, and cut down a lot of the trees, cleared out the poison ivy, and then it looked like this is the finished product. This is really, well, it's where the canal, it's the abandoned canal. And this section has, it's got a lot of trees that have grown in, and a lot of, it's not exactly the same size and shape that it was, but it's pretty much the location where the canal was when it was in operation. And we made this into a park. We have a kiosk with a map and information about the canal there at Oak Tree Lane. This is near Watchung Avenue, near exit 151 of the Garden State Parkway. Watchung Avenue intersects with Broughton, and then if you turn onto Broughton, the first street is Oak Tree Lane. If you drive up there, you'll see our wayfinding signs and a place to park. You can walk through this section of canal, and then we're expanding the trail too. So there's another little section of property that paralleled where the canal was, that was owned by the town. It was set aside for potential use for roads that we've also turned into part of the Canal Greenway. And we have these wayfinding signs along it. This is the Pilch Street Bridge. This is a footbridge that crosses the Garden State Parkway when you're driving up there and you see that footbridge. This is it. And it overlaps with the Lenape Trail. The Lenape Trail crosses the Pilch Street Bridge. And in part of this expansion project, we just added another section of trail. This is another scout project. This is behind Demarest School. We had to get the permission for the easement on the property and had to put up a fence. That's the parkway fence on the left and the school fence on the right. The scouts cleaning up. And now this is open as trail for the Morris Canal Greenway Trail, and we're relocating the Lenape Trail so that it overlaps this section of Greenway Trail. So the Lenape Trail goes through Montclair in several places. There are 18 parks, and I didn't mean to have that slide there. 36 miles. The Lenape Trail is 36 miles long. It connects 18 parks and 11 municipalities. This is the section around Montclair in this area. So it goes through Eagle Rock Reservation, and this is a trail that's, I mentioned before, is maintained by the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, volunteers. Goes through Hilltop Reservation, through Cedar Grove, Presby Memorial Iris Gardens, the Mills Reservation, Brookdale Park, and then the section that we were looking at is right here. So after Clark's Pond, this is where the footbridge crosses the Garden State Parkway, and then it goes off into Nutley. So this is the Pilch Street Bridge, and this part here is the Greenway, where at Oak Tree Lane, this is Oak Tree Lane, where you're actually in a section of the canal. And then this section was right next to where the canal was. This is the new section right here behind Demarest School. So we're redirecting the Lenape Trail so it goes on the Greenway Trail and over the side of the street to Clark's Pond. The Trail Conference has these hiking maps. This is an example of one of them. There's an app called Avenza, which you can use to load these maps, and they show all their hiking trails. They've got different sections. The state split up into different sections. And they're numbered. This is map 125 of Jersey Highlands East. But this section shows an example. They have the Morris Canal on their map. This line with the dots on it is the path of the Morris Canal. And wherever you see a red section, that means that that's a trail. So there's a trail right here in Boonton. There's another section over here. This is Route 80 here. So you can see that's another place where the canal is not accessible because of the highway. And there's some really nice scenic hikes if you're looking for a really short scenic hike to experience the canal. These are a couple examples of places. There's one in Boonton. This is what it looks like. So there are some little pieces where the canal is still watered and the towpath is still maintained the way it was. This was actually posted there's a Morris Canal Facebook page. Somebody posted these photographs. And Wharton, there's a very nice section of canal in Wharton. They have a canal day once a year where they have boat rides and tours and activities. And on the Wharton section, there was a lock. This block in the photo on the left was completely buried under, when the canal was abandoned, they just sort of filled it in with rocks and debris. But a few years ago, they started to dig it out and preserve it. So most of the walls of the lock were intact, and they have preserved it, and they're actually going to make it a working lock. So when you go through this boat ride, you'll be able to go into the lock, go up 10 feet, and then go on into, there's a lake on the upper level of the lock here in Wharton. And another great place to go to learn about the canal and see parts of it is Waterloo Village. They also have boat rides. They have canal days there. It is a state park. It's open every day, but not necessarily that you can walk around. You're free to walk through it, but they don't have activities, and some of the buildings open on most of the regular weekdays. They do have canal days. They were having them on certain weekends where they have boat rides and exhibits. There are a lot of really nice historic houses. There's a church there. The houses haven't been maintained. They sort of went through some deferred maintenance for several years, but they have been getting some funding recently to restore some of the houses there. And this is another section of Trail Conference map with an example of some of the interesting artifacts that you can see on some of these trails. This is showing, the highway here is Route 80, and this highway is Route 206. If you take the Route 206 exit from Route 80, you'll see signs directing you to Waterloo Village. And then this right here is a Sussex trail. There's a rail to trail and an abandoned train line that went up this way. And it's now a hiking trail. This icon here indicates this is the Morris Canal Greenway. So this is where the canal went, and there's a trail that you can walk here. This is where Waterloo Village is. The canal went on an inclined plane here on approaching Waterloo Village, and then it crossed this lake and then continued on in this direction. This direction. Another place that's wiped out by Route 80. But you can get to this trail. The map on the left is an All Trails. That's another app, yet another app with maps, with trails. You can walk on Continental Drive. This is the trail here. Take this trail. This trail was another abandoned railroad, and this is the Morris Canal. This is where the Morris Canal was down here. But there's some very interesting artifacts here if you were to take this trail. When I mentioned ice was one of the products that was transported on the canal, this is an abandoned ice house. From a distance, it looks like logs, but these are actually terracotta tubes that the ice house was built from, and the walls are still standing. And if you continue on that trail, you'll see this is an abandoned inclined plane that's across the river from Waterloo Village. This was plane 4 west. We're now the 4th plane west of Lake Hepatcong. But there's some beautiful stonework that still exists from this inclined plane. You can't get to here directly from Waterloo Village. This was some more stonework. When the railroad I was talking about, that's part of the trail. There was a bridge here. The railroad went across. These are abutments for the railroad bridge. And down at the bottom, across the lake here, is where Waterloo Village is. The canal, the mules, there was a bridge that the mules would walk across this bridge, leading the boats across the lake. But the bridge looks like this in the picture on the left today, so you can't walk across it. But they are planning to rebuild it, so you'll be able to walk from Waterloo Village. You'll be able to walk across the bridge and go to the trail and see the inclined plane on the other side. So there are a lot of other things. Now, this isn't directly related to the Morris Canal, but and other hiking possibilities that are part of the trail conference system of trails. Wildcat Ridge, Hibernia. Hibernia was a mining village. And there are a lot of trails around there. The Morris Canal wasn't right in this area, but all the iron ore and the finished iron products that were mined here and created here were shipped on the canal on some of these railroads that are abandoned now and now have become trails. But there are a lot of interesting artifacts that you can see on some of these. This is the parking area at the trailhead. So if you're interested in these kind of tours, Joe McKasick leads these industrial heritage tours. They're sponsored by the Morris Canal County Park Commission. He's been doing this for 22 years. But you'll go to a site like this and he'll give you these handouts with maps that show the location, what it used to, sometimes historic photographs of houses and mining operations that used to exist in these locations. So most of these trails that you saw on the preceding map are where these railroads used to be, and some of these mining roads used to be are now trails, and you can walk through and see some of the remnants of some of these. These are some of the other industrial heritage walks that he does. Orland, a mining ghost town. He does a greenway walk from Denville to Rockaway, Split Rock Furnace. These are all connected to this these former iron ore mining and iron forge operations that are part of trails that are trail conference trails that you can find on their maps. This is the Hibernia. This is one of the artifacts from the Hibernia mining operation. One of the other things I've been volunteering for is doing surveys of invasives, and every invasive, I mean, a lot of the high invasive species that you see around New Jersey are right at this trailhead. Partly because it was all cleared, it was all stripped because it was all bare when they had the mining operation here, and the things that sort of come into a bare property tend to be these invasive species. It's also, you'll often find a lot of them at the trailhead. You'll see a lot of knotweed and garlic mustard, mugwort, Japanese honeysuckle, burning bush, all these invasives that we find in North Jersey. This is another off of one of the trails at Hibernia. There's actually a mine opening that's blocked up now. If you happen to be here in the summer, I was here on some of those summer days last year when it was 90 degrees. You can feel this cool 60 degrees breeze. Well, it's actually too cold to stand in front of it. You can find your way to this opening by following the cold air. This is another example at that site. Whenever you're on a trail and you see a very level grade, it usually means it was either a road or a railroad. On the left, you can actually see the railroad ties here. This was one of the mining railroads in that area. And also with these level areas, they often are the first places to flood. They actually relocated this trail because it was flooded. Another thing to look for, if you see something, you might see some unnatural looking hills. These, you might at first glance think these are just hills. These are actually piles of rock that were left from the mining operation that were just piled here. And 50, 100 years ago, they're covered with trees now. And if you're out and about now, you might see these are one of the wildflowers that are in bloom now, spring beauties. And they're also on some of the trail conference trails, some of these furnaces that are from the iron operations at Wildcat Ridge, Split Rock Reservoir. There's a furnace on the left, and at Sterling Forest, you'll see that furnace that's on the right. That was actually rebuilt in, I think in the 60s. So if you want to learn more about the Canal Society, they have a website. If you'd like to get more information about those industrial heritage tours, you can email Joe McKasick. There's his email. I'll leave this up for a couple minutes. There's a Morris Canal Greenway Facebook for Bloomfield, and there's a Morris Canal Facebook page. Joe is also affiliated with the Society for Industrial Archaeology, the Roebling chapter, and they're usually included in some of these trails and some of the industrial heritage hikes that he does. And then lenapetrail.org has a complete map and guidebook for the Lenape Trail. So each one of these parks and all the landmarks and interesting things that you can find along the Lenape Trail are all documented in a free file that you can get from the site. You can also download the Lenape Trail map that works on that Avenza app. And there's also a map that you can just to look at, a map that you could print out. So that concludes my talk. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Can't hear you, Jane.
You had several
Thank you so
questions
much.
that popped up. But first, open it up to everyone. If they have any questions, they can ask. And I've got several that were in the chat room. Anybody have anything they'd like to share? Questions? Then I'll throw a couple out. The two apps that you mentioned were Avenza, Avenza,
Yes.
and then the Morris Canal Greenway, which I just found by just putting in Morris Canal and it popped right up. So I'm already downloaded.
Oh, great. Yeah, Bloomfield, Morris Canal, Bloomfield. Yeah, you'll find it in the App Store.
Somebody asked whether or not there was a spur to Pompton Lakes.
That was a feeder. When I showed that map, that when they didn't have enough water from Lake Apatcong, they built a feeder connecting to Pompton Lakes. I think they used it for shipping a little bit too, but it was mainly built as a feeder to get additional water from Greenwood Lake and that area to get additional water into the canal.
Also some interest in the Collins House. Can you tell us a little bit the history of that, how old it is?
Yeah, so let me see if I can go back to that slide. The original part of the house was built in the late 1700s, around 1790. And one of the reasons that it's significant, one of the reasons we got it, was easy to get it on the state and national register, is it's a surviving example of an East Jersey cottage. This is the original part of the house here, which was East Jersey Cottage, where you'll see these 3 bays, usually 1 door and 2 windows. And then when they built this addition, this was built by John Collins. This part was built by Isaac Collins, who was one of the carpenters on the canal. He followed the same Jersey cottage style, 1.5 stories. And so this section was built in the 1820s. There are a couple other additions that were built over time, but and it's there were a lot of these East Jersey cottages in the area, but very few surviving. Well, and some of them survived too, but you wouldn't recognize them because they're covered with vinyl siding, and that people built dormers because you can't stand up on the second floor on the edges of the room. So and they didn't have a lot of windows, so people added dormers, so you don't recognize a lot of them. But and it's also in its original on the original property. It was next door was a paper mill. Went through a lot of different names. It's commonly known as a diamond paper mill. But the paper mill bought the house from the Collins family around 1900 and used it as the caretaker's home for the paper mill. The last owner of the paper mill was Markel. They still had a caretaker living there. And even after Markel shut down, they allowed the caretaker to live there. At the time, the town bought the property from Markel, and somebody said, hey, I think there might be some historically significant stuff here. I don't know if you should tear it down. So they did a historic survey, and they determined that there wasn't anything significant to maintain of the mill. And that's where the town sold that property to the organization that built Kinder Towers, but the town maintained the property with the house, agreeing to not tear it down because it was historically significant, and the town owned it since then. But the caretaker continued to, and his wife continued to live there for several years into the 90s, I think, maybe even into the early 2000s. And then they had to move out. They moved into Kinder Towers.
I hope there was a wall on it while they were living there.
Yes, it was actually in relatively good shape while they were living there. It didn't really get really in really bad shape until it was abandoned for 15 or 20 years, and it was vandalized and got a lot of water damage.
Just drawing, George noted that you have an article on the Collins House, and he has a website on the chat room if anybody wants more information about that.
Yeah, Collins.org, and George helped a lot writing the article. Yeah, he wrote an article for the Glen Ridge Historical Society.
And the other thing that somebody asked is, could you share your contact information or a website for more information?
About well, that's most of the stuff. A lot of the keeping up with stuff. There's a lot of stuff on Facebook pages. There's the Canal Society, the Morris Canal. There's the collinshouse.org. The Morris Canal Greenway is mostly our activity is through a Facebook page. And then the Lenape Trail and the New Jersey. I should have put the trail conference on here too. The New Jersey Trail Conference is the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, NYNJTC.org. That's where you can get the maps, the hiking maps. And if you're interested in volunteering too, they'd be glad to have volunteers who maintain trails and do invasive species management and also help maintain the Lenape Trail. They have volunteer days for doing work on the Lenape Trail too.
Did I miss anybody's questions on the chat room? If you're still on, unmute yourself and share your question.
Hi, I have a question. Tony's Brook runs throughout Montclair. Was that part of the Morris Canal?
No, it wasn't. No, the closest Montclair, the closest the canal came to Montclair would have been the section that, well, it really wasn't that close to Montclair. Where we're talking about the Lenape Trail, sort of Brookdale Park. The canal didn't go to Brookdale Park, but you're probably 1 or 2 miles away from where the canal was when you're in Brookdale Park.
Okay. I was just wondering what the origin of Tony's Brook was.
It's a tributary of either First or Second River. I'm not real sure about that myself.
Mike Farrelly was on the line. Mike, can you answer that question? Is Mike still on the line?
Yep, sorry. I'm sorry. I was checking my notes on the original part of the Collins House. According to the cornerstone that was built in 1759, and because of that, I was not paying attention to the question.
The question is, what's the origin of Tony's Brook? Where does it start? Is it First or Second River? Do you know?
Earl.
It starts
Second River
someplace
starts
up
up
by
in Upper Montclair.
It starts up by the college.
Yeah.
It starts as a little spring up by along Upper Mountain Avenue by the college.
Isn't it related to
We lost you, Jan.
The canal was over this way, sort of to the east of Mont.
I said, isn't it related to Pearl River as well? Coming from up close to behind the college?
Yeah, there's a little bit of spur called the Pearl River.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just I'll tell you a little bit about the cornerstone. So the Collins House, one of the newer additions, we don't know the exact date. It probably would have been, I think they were estimating 1900s. it was obviously, in addition, it was built of different materials, different style, different foundation. That's where the cornerstone was that had the 1759 date on it. So it was obviously had been moved from someplace else to that location. We don't know where it came from. It might have been an older original house that was in the location, or it might have been from someplace else that the family might have moved it there. But a few years ago, it was stolen. I do have photographs of it, and it was dated 1759, but it's not there anymore. We'll have photographs of it interpreting it in the museum when we get the museum in place.
Anyone else?
It was really interesting. Thank you very much.
Rich,
Thank
you
you.
got a lot of, you also got a lot of nice feedback in the chat room. We had a couple of people that had to jump off to go back to homeschooling and work, and fantastic lunch and learn for my family. Thank you. Thank you. Love seeing the photos. Well done, and a hearty round of applause.